Have you ever been to a dinner party so strange that it ended with no one ever speaking of it again? Well, this one didn't just end with silence, it ended with cannibalism, and a curse that still lingers 5 centuries later. Have you ever sat down to a meal and thought, this could be the last supper I ever enjoy? Probably not. Most of us take our dinners for granted, a glass of something comforting, a plate of something warm, and maybe a good story over the table. But just once, that story turned into something no one at the feast would ever forget. And neither will you. Now I want you to imagine this. It's the 16th century, deep in the snowbound forests of France. You're not in Paris, no, not the city of lights and elegant banquets. You're in the rugged heartland, the kind of place where wolves outnumber people, and the cold makes your breath turn into clouds that drift like ghosts. And in this bleak, unforgiving wilderness, a nobleman, one with a very long name and a very short temper, decides to throw a grand winter feast. Why? Because it's the season of fasting, and nothing screams power quite like breaking the rules in front of everyone. Lent, fasting, pfft. This man wanted roast boar, sweetmeats, and barrels of wine, and so he summoned the local lords, their wives, their men-at-arms, even a few monks, because if you're going to scandalize the church, why not invite them to watch? This feast was meant to be legendary, and oh, it was. The fire was roaring, the tables were heavy with food. There were jesters and music and dancers in masks twirling like fallen leaves in the flickering candlelight. No one questioned the meat, where it came from, what kind it was. They were too busy stuffing their faces, laughing and whispering, secrets behind goblets of spiced wine. But not all the guests were there for pleasure. One woman, seated near the back, watched the whole thing with eyes like flint. Her name was Eloise, and while history doesn't record much about her, what we do know paints a picture of someone who was not easily fooled. She didn't eat much, she didn't drink much. But she listened to the way the host slurred his words after too much mead, to the way the servants looked at each other when new platters arrived from the kitchen, and especially to the way no one seemed to recognize the venison being served. Now, in a place where hunger was more familiar than warmth, you'd think people would recognize deer. But not this meat. It was rich, gamey, odd. And when Eloise whispered her suspicions to the monk beside her, his face drained of color. The monk had heard stories, not tales. Not fairy tales, real ones, about men lost in the woods, about soldiers never returning from patrol, about special meat served by noblemen who believed themselves above both law and morality. Now, before we leap ahead, let's pause. Because this moment right here is where the story forks in 2 directions. If you're the sort who prefers your history dry and dignified, I'm sorry. This isn't that kind of tale. This is about what happens when you feed ambition too much wine, when you believe the rules of nature don't apply to your bloodline, and when the hunger inside a man begins to look a little too much like the hunger inside a wolf. Eloise, bless her unshakable nerve, didn't wait for dessert. She left quietly without a word, and 2 days later she returned with armed riders and a bishop. What they found in the kitchen still turns stomachs 5 centuries later. Bones. Human bones, stripped clean, boiled in pots, still warm on the embers, and a ledger, tucked beneath. The sack of onions listing names, dates, weights. You see, this wasn't the first feast. It wasn't even the 5th. It was just the first one anyone survived long enough to report. And the nobleman, he didn't deny it. He just laughed. They were peasants, he said. What else were they good for? That sentence alone was enough to make the bishop retch into the ashes. But here's the strange part. Despite the horror, despite the trial, the execution, and the whispered prayers for the dead, this feast lived on. Not just in the chronicles, but in every cautionary tale told by firelight from that century on. It wasn't just about cannibalism. No, it was about arrogance, about forgetting that power has limits, that hunger, unchecked, can devour not just flesh, but soul. And perhaps that's why even now some locals still mark that date each winter with silence. No feasting, no fires, just bread and water and a quiet nod to the lesson learned too late. We've begun our story with a table set for horror and a guest list that didn't all make it home. But the worst and strangest revelations are still to come. You might think that after something like that, the tale would vanish into the shadows where it belonged. A nobleman caught feeding his guests a stew of stolen lives, punished in full public view. Surely the story would die with him. But it didn't. In fact, it got worse, because the real question wasn't just what had happened that night at the feast, but why. Why would a man of wealth and power, with access to all the comforts the 16th century could offer, go so far off the rails that he'd start serving people like pork? Let's go back, before the feast, before the kitchen full of bones, even before Eloise raised her eyebrows at that suspicious roast. Let's go to his childhood. His name was Armand de Sauveterre, heir to a decaying chateau and a legacy soaked in more blood than wine. His family had once been something, proud, battle-hardened knights with banners flying and peasants who feared the sound of their boots. But by the time Armand was born, all that was left was a crumbling stone manor, a roof that leaked, and debts taller than the tower. His father died young, some say of madness, some say of mushrooms picked from the wrong side of the forest. His mother raised him with the kind of affection you might show a porcelain doll. No real warmth, just expectation. You were born to rule, she told him, even if there's no one left to rule over. And Armand believed her. He grew up isolated, fed on books full of glory and conquest. He spent more time with portraits of ancestors than with people. The local villagers avoided him. Animals ran from him. The servants whispered about what they saw in his eyes when he watched them work. An odd hunger, not for food, for control. By the time he was 25, he had inherited the title, the land, and all the unpaid debts of his ancestors. He needed money. Fast. And where there's desperation, there's invention. The first disappearances were blamed on wolves. The forest was thick with them. But the bones they left behind had clean cuts, not bites. And there were no screams, no signs of struggle. Just missing people and silent snow. And then, just like that, his fortunes turned. He held a hunting festival, just a small one at first, a few nobles. A table laid out in a grand hall no one had entered in years. The wine flowed, the laughter echoed through the hills, and the meat? Fresh, he called it, a rare delicacy from my private game preserve. People asked no questions. That was the trick back then. If the candles were bright enough, if the music was loud enough, no one dared look beneath the tablecloth. What truly unsettled the region wasn't just the horror of the meal itself. It was how long it went unnoticed, or worse, ignored, because those noble guests, the ones who licked their greasy fingers and called it the best roast they'd ever had, they didn't all flee after the arrest. Some defended him. He was eccentric, they said. The meat was already served. What would you have us do? Go hungry? Ah, yes. Vanity's favorite mask is always manners. Even the church tried to keep things quiet at first. It wasn't just about morality, it was about image. If one of their flock could do something so monstrous, what did that say about the divine order? But Eloise, oh, she didn't let it go. She testified in front of every trembling scribe and sniveling magistrate about what she saw. About the odd taste, about the ledger in the pantry, about the locked basement room with shackles on the wall. Armand was sentenced to death, of course, but not by sword or gallows, or even fire. They walled him in, alive, inside the ruined cellar of his own estate. No trial by combat, no crowd to cheer or boo, just stone and silence. And they say, to this day, if you walk near the ruins of Sauveterre during a harsh winter evening, you'll hear something tapping from beneath the earth. Not weeping, not howling, tapping, like someone counting guests. Now, here's where things turn especially strange. For months after Armand's sentence, the villagers who lived near the chateau swore their dreams were plagued by visions. Dreams of lavish feasts where their dead relatives beckoned them to the table. Dreams of red wine that turned to blood in their mouths. Dreams of a voice whispering, "There's always room for one more." Some claimed the land was cursed. Others said it was guilt. But something had shifted. The soil turned sour. Crops failed, and a black fungus spread across the oldest trees in the forest. They burned the manor down, or so they thought, because sometime in the next century another noble family bought the land. They built a hunting lodge over the old foundation, fresh walls, new windows, and eventually a dining hall. And you can guess what came next. The cooks began to report strange things: vanishing food, unmarked doors that opened into empty corridors, and the faint smell of meat roasting, when no fire had been lit. But no one believed them until the next feast. By the time the new family arrived, wealthy, ambitious, and desperately eager to rise in noble ranks, the tale of Armand de Sauveterre had already slipped into legend. Whispers at best. A curiosity buried in frost-bitten folklore. They'd heard something about an old scandal, but who listens to peasant ghost stories when there are game birds to shoot and political favors to win? And so the old chateau was swept aside, as if its history could be cleared away like cobwebs from a beam. In its place rose a fashionable lodge, 2 stories high, polished oak floors, hunting trophies on every wall, and a great dining hall with windows so tall you could see the moonlight touch the snow. The new lord of the estate, Baron Henri Lussan, was everything Armand had once pretended to be: charismatic, charming, a born entertainer. He loved to feed people, lavish dinners, midnight suppers, fireside wine tastings. If it involved food and company, Henri was first to raise a glass. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that something had been left behind. Not just the stone foundations buried under the cellar, not just forgotten ledgers or a single name scratched into the underside of a rotted beam. No, something darker, hungrier. It began with the meat. A butcher, hired from the next province, overclaimed the haunches he delivered each week were being used up too quickly. "I brought 20 pounds on Thursday," he told the steward, "and you say it's gone by Friday morning?" The steward nodded, puzzled. "They say it was served at breakfast. Roasted. Roasted? Venison at breakfast? That didn't sound right." Soon after, servants started quitting. They said the pantry doors would unlock themselves at night, that the kitchen smelled of charred flesh even when no ovens were lit. One girl swore she saw something crouching in the back of the cold cellar, a figure that didn't move, didn't breathe, but whose eyes glinted red like coals in the dark. And in the dining hall, well, at first it was just little things. Guests reported their plates being warm before they were filled. The meat was always cooked to perfection, even when the chef swore he hadn't finished. A few guests laughed and called it a house, with a will of its own. But then came the night of the eclipse. A special dinner had been planned, a celebration of the lunar eclipse, a fashionable trend among nobles who liked to toast things they didn't understand. All the local elite were invited. Roasted fowl, honeyed fruits, almond tarts, all the usual trappings of opulence. Henri even hired musicians to play in each corner of the hall, so the sound would swirl like a waltz in the air. But halfway through the main course, the lights dimmed. Not just from the eclipse outside, but the candles, each one flickering, low one by one, until only the fire in the hearth remained. A cold gust of wind, though no windows were open, and then a smell, not wine, not meat iron, char. Something metallic and bitter and old. One guest, a rather superstitious baroness, dropped her fork. She stared at her plate. Her meat looked wrong. The texture, the color. She stood and screamed. Others followed. Chairs fell. Goblets spilled. Musicians stopped playing. The servants came rushing in and found the guests huddled in the corners of the room, pale and trembling. Henri, their host, was standing at the head of the table, carving meat with a silver knife, smiling, but his eyes were empty, black. Not the kind of black from shadow, but the kind you see in a well that has no bottom. They dragged him away. He fought, yes, but not like a man, like something that had borrowed a body and didn't want to give it back. The local priest was called the next morning, and the feast had vanished. The food, the platters, the bones, all gone. The kitchen was spotless. Not a stain to be found. No meat, no dishes, no scraps, as if nothing had ever been served. Henri never recovered. Some said it was madness. Others said he had seen too far. He spoke only once in the days that followed, curled up in a woolen blanket in the chapel basement. "I didn't cook it," he whispered. "I only carved what was already there." And so the lodge was abandoned. Again. Locked, bolted, and left to decay. No one touched it. Not for decades. But stories kept surfacing. Children dared each other to sneak inside and touch the long dining table still sitting in the dark. A local shepherd swore he saw candles glowing behind the windows during a snowstorm. One woman, half mad, half drunk, claimed she'd heard music playing from within and smelled roast meat on the wind. But no one went in, because by now the villagers had a name for it. They called it the banquet that eats back, a house that remembers, that feeds on memory, on guilt, on the scent of hunger itself, a place where every bite is a curse and every toast is a trap, and still it waits, because places like this don't die, they just digest slowly. Years passed. The trees crept closer to the abandoned lodge, swallowing it in silence. Snow fell thicker each winter, as if the land itself was trying to bury what had happened. But stories, as you know, are hardier than frost, and some doors, no matter how tightly bolted, have a way of opening themselves again. By the turn of the 20th century, most folks considered the old Sauveterre estate a fairy tale, a ghastly fireside tale to keep curious children from wandering too far into the woods. But there was one man who didn't laugh it off. His name was Michel Corbin, a young historian barely 30, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a fondness for dusty archives. He'd grown up listening to his grandmother tell the story of the cannibal feast, thinking it just another spooky bedtime fable. But during a quiet winter in Paris, while combing through a pile of forgotten letters in the National Archives, Michel found something chilling. A dinner invitation. Elegant, handwritten, and dated exactly 2 days before the now famous winter. Banquet of Armand de Sauveterre. The signature? Armand come hungry. It was too real, too perfect. And Michel, being both curious and just the right amount of foolish, decided he had to see the ruins for himself. He traveled north in January. Snow in the trees, silence so deep it seemed to press against his ears. It took him 2 days to find the remnants of the chateau. Beneath ivy and frost, the stones still stood. The cellar was still there, cold as a tomb and just as quiet. Then he found it, the door to the dining hall. Not the new one built during Henri Lucin's time. No, this was older, hidden behind a false wall. A room Michel had no record of, no map, no mention in any estate document. The door was locked, of course. But it didn't resist long. He stepped inside, the air was warm, that was the first thing he noticed. No draught, no dust. And the second thing, the table, set, plates gleaming, silver polished, candles unlit, but fresh, a loaf of bread still soft, a carafe of deep red wine that shimmered even in the low light, and one chair pulled out, waiting. Now. Let's pause, because this, dear viewer, is the moment every ghost story either veers into madness or revelation. Michel sat. He didn't eat. He wasn't that far gone. But he looked around, took notes scribbled into his leather journal. Hours passed. He swears time didn't move properly in there. The light didn't shift. His watch froze. And then, footsteps. Soft, deliberate. From the other end of the room. He turned but saw no one, only shadows dancing against the far wall. Then a sound, a soft clink of metal on porcelain. A fork, lifting. The plate in front of him had food on it now, meat, steaming, still pink in the middle. Michel bolted. He ran from the hall, through the broken estate, into the trees. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the nearest village. Frost clinging to his coat, heart hammering like a drum in a siege. They didn't believe him, of course, but the journal, that was real. He published excerpts a year later, under a pseudonym. The book never sold well, but it reached the right hands, or the wrong ones, depending on how you look at it, because not long after, the property was purchased once again. A wealthy Belgian collector with a taste for haunted European sites. He restored the lodge, invited friends, hosted elaborate dinners. He even marketed it as Le Château du Dernier Souper, The castle of the Last Supper. He said it with a wink. A joke, of course, until the first guest disappeared. No evidence, no blood. Just an empty chair and a wine glass cracked clean down the stem. They closed it again after that. For good this time, some said. But you know how stories go. The real ones always find a way back, and here's what might chill you more than anything else. According to local records, the property is still privately owned. No tours, no photos, no trespassing. But every few years, someone new arrives, always in winter, always alone. Sometimes they stay for just a few weeks, sometimes longer. But sooner or later, the village hears it. Laughter in the woods, a candle, flickering behind frosted windows, a smell, rich, strange, familiar in a way you don't want to remember. And then, silence. The chair is waiting again because the table is never truly empty. It would be easy to leave this story behind now, to close the book with a shiver, maybe light a candle and tell yourself it was just one of those old stories meant to scare children and sell ghost tours. But that would miss the point entirely. Because the truth is, this story has never really been about one monstrous nobleman or one cursed feast in a forgotten chateau. No, what makes this tale linger, what gives it teeth, is how familiar it all feels. Not in the details, no. But in the hunger behind it. Armand de Sauveterre wasn't the first man to gorge himself on the powerless. He just didn't bother to pretend. He didn't hide his appetites behind laws or customs or polite applause. He fed because he believed he could. Because no one told him no until it was far too late. And that, dear viewer, is the real horror. Not the cannibalism, but the quiet complicity that surrounded it. The guests who smiled and swallowed their doubts. The nobles who kept coming back for seconds. The church that looked the other way. The chefs who sharpened knives and told themselves they were just doing their jobs. In every generation, there's always a feast of some kind. A banquet laid by the powerful, consumed by the willing and paid for by the unseen. It may not look like roast haunches and flickering candles anymore, but look closely. You'll find it. A company that thrives on cutting corners while its workers skip meals. A mansion that rises from the sweat of invisible hands. A celebration built atop bones no one wants to name. We tell ghost stories, perhaps, because we can't quite bring ourselves to tell the truth. Not directly. Not without masks. But the old stories they know and they never forget. Maybe that's why people still avoid that corner of the forest in northern France. Maybe that's why no new homes have ever been built there, despite the land being fertile. The tax is low and the trees older than memory. Because deep down we remember what happened. We remember Eloise, who refused to be fooled by candlelight and charm. We remember the villagers who said no to celebration and yes to silence. And we remember the tapping. Always the tapping. There's a certain kind of justice in stories like this. Not the kind that comes from courts or kings, but the kind whispered in winds and echoed in empty rooms. A justice that says, we see you, we saw what you did, and we remember. So tonight, when you sit down to your meal, take a moment, just one. Think of the guests at Armand's table, of the meat no one could name, of the chairs still waiting in the dark. And if the wind outside your window sounds just a bit like footsteps, perhaps leave a seat empty, just in case. If you've enjoyed this strange journey through one of history's most chilling dinner parties, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever heard a tale like this, something that seems too horrifying to be true, but too specific to be fake? Don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more curious tales from the forgotten corners of the past, and tap the bell if you'd like to be notified before the next course is served. Until then, sleep warm, stay curious, and maybe stick to soup.